Want to chat today a little bit about the wonderful hymn Amazing Grace. So, here's some things you may not know about Amazing Grace. It was not written as an African American spiritual. Many people believe that. It was actually written in 1772 and published in 1779 by John Newton. It was a Christian hymn. However, it has had particular influence in folk music and has become an emblematic Black spiritual thanks to its American revival by Ira Sankey and evangelist Dwight Moody in the late 1800s here in America. And then again, it had another revival in the 1960s with the revival of folk music. So that's a little interesting tidbit. Now, another thing to know, the author of the poem, John Newton, he was an English poet and an Anglican clergyman. He lived 1725 to 1807. Now, when I say that to you, that sounds very wonderful. He sounds like a distinguished man. He was a minister. But to just say that is not the whole story with this fellow. So here it is in a nutshell. As a child, his mother passed away when he was 7 years old, so that was sad. Now, she did have a spiritual influence in his life, but at 7 years old, he was quite young. After that, he was passed to boarding schools. I don't think his father was in the picture very much. He became very bitter, angry, disobedient, headstrong. He was lost. I consider him Saul at this point in his life. He goes on to be a sailor. Then he was pressed into the Royal Navy, which sounds good. However, he promptly deserted. He was captured, and after 2 days awaiting his fate, he was flogged. At the time, actually later back when he was reflecting back on his youth, in a series of letters, he writes, quote, "Like an unwary sailor who quits his port just before a rising storm, I renounced the hopes and comforts of the gospel at the very time when every other comfort was about to fail me." So at this time in his life, he goes on to denounce his faith, and he becomes absolutely abominable. His disagreements with his superiors and other shipmates result in him being almost starved to death, imprisoned while at sea, chained up like the slaves that they were carrying on their boats. And as a punishment for his constant insubordination and foul mouth, he himself was enslaved and forced to work on a plantation in the British colony of Sierra Leone. Fortunately for him, he was only there for 2 months. His father was able to get him a reprieve. He intervened, and Newton was sent back to England on a boat called the Greyhound. And even after kind of getting that redemption, that gift from his dad to get out of those horrible circumstances, it is recorded that on that journey home, he was the most lewd and rude and crude of all the shipmates, and he even created new profanity to, quote, exceed the limits of verbal debauchery. This sounds like a terrible, terrible person. Remember, I told you he was, a good English poet and Anglican clergyman. Well, on the night of March 9th in 1748, when he is now 23 years old and he's coming home on that ship, the Greyhound, they are awoken at night with a brutal storm while they're in the North Atlantic. And after seeing a shipmate of his being swept off the deck and out to sea in the deep hours of the night, he's afraid, he's worried, he's about to lose his life, and he's expecting that they're going to be capsized. He and another shipmate, they tie themselves to the ship's pump, and they keep themselves from being washed overboard. And then in the next morning, in great peril, he cries out to the Lord, and he later writes, he says, "That 10th day of March is much remembered by me, and I have never suffered it to pass unnoticed since the year 1748. The Lord came from on high and delivered me from the deep waters. So that life and death experience for him, the survival of that, maybe creates an epiphany for him. So a little bit like Paul and Saul. So the harrowing experience there, the cry out to the Lord for mercy, caused him to begin to ask if he was worthy of God's mercy and in any way redeemable. And so not only had he neglected his faith, but he had directly opposed it and mocked it. Those that had faith in God, he mocked them, deriding and denouncing God as a myth. But this experience creates that conversion in him. So Saul becomes Paul. And Newton goes on to continue with struggles. He was far from perfect, but over the course of his life, and with the help from the love of his life, Polly, he began studying Christian theology, and he does later go on to become an abolitionist against slavery. And then he was ordained in the Church of England in 1764, so at the age of 39. It's a very interesting story behind this poem. And actually, the original title of the poem was Faith's Review and Expectation. So that sounds like a very perfect title for what John Newton himself was going through over the course of his life, and when he finally was able to face his demons and then accept God and Jesus Christ as his Savior. So I hope you found today interesting. Look forward to seeing you at church on Sunday. Bye-bye.